So I'm here with Richard Darlington, the Head of Strategic Communications for Well-Made Strategy. I am Nabila Alibai, Senior Associate at Well-Made Strategy. And today we're going to be talking to you about market systems facilitation and how strategic communications can help you do your job better. We have been working on financial inclusion for almost 4 years now. Richard, tell us a little bit about your work.
Well, thanks, Nabila. It's great to be here. I met FSD Africa back in 2014. I actually just did some volunteering for them when they were first setting up. Then they were sharing an office with FSD Kenya. There were just 4 staff, and now they've grown and grown. And that introduced me to the FSD network, 9 different countries where country programs are working on financial inclusion. And they wanted some help. They wanted some help with their communications. And in the process of bringing the communication skills that I'd developed in the UK to different countries in Africa, I got to know more and more about the way they work as market system facilitators. And I got to understand more and more about the framework that they use, M4P, Markets for the Poor. And I got to understand more about how market systems is a different way of doing development. And so eventually they asked me to write it up, and kind of 4 years later and multiple projects in lots of different countries, we've now come up with this handbook, which we hope is going to be useful, not just for people working in Africa, but working across the developing world, and not just for people working on financial inclusion, but for working on M4P programs and trying to change market systems in economies all around the world.
This handbook that you've put together is going to be extremely useful for a lot of practitioners working in financial inclusion. And we're really excited to be able to launch the handbook soon together with a companion podcast series and a blog series that should help everyone with their strategic communications as they work on financial inclusion on the continent.
So I think broadly we've got 9 different elements to this talk. We'll start with M4P, but then we'll get into some communications techniques, which I think are useful not just in the M4P context, but for development more widely, also for think tanks and research-led organizations, data-driven organizations, of which there are many working in development. But obviously, because this is about M4P and about market systems, we'll start with just looking at those communications dilemmas that are particular to that approach. So you'll see on the screen right now the 9 different sections of this talk. That's what's coming up. Let's get into it. So the first thing, I think it's important to talk about different types of different levels on which you can communicate if you're running an M4P program, if you're operating as a market systems facilitator. And these 3 actually map to the way that we've structured the companion podcast series. So we've got 3 different levels. One is the program level. So FSD Africa, for example, is a program, but it works in lots of different markets. So, for example, it might work in the insurance market in Ghana, might also work on the remittance market in Rwanda. There's 2 completely different markets. So there's a program level comms in terms of the way that FSD Africa orients itself, the way it corporately brands itself, the way people understand the values, the mission, how that organization works, who the people are that are in it, where its funding comes from. But that is different to market level communications, which, in those 2 examples, insurance in Ghana, remittances in Rwanda, yes, they're both financial services, but they are 2 very distinct and different markets. So doing communications at market level is different. And then finally, project level. Obviously, every M4P program, every market system facilitator has a portfolio approach. They have a portfolio of different projects that they're working on. They're working on different parts of the different bits of a market system all at the same time. And those projects will be at different stages. So doing communications project by project, there's different considerations compared to when you're doing communications at market level, and different considerations again when you're doing communications at program level. So if you want to get in depth into either of those 3, program, market or project level, there's good news because we've made a podcast just for you. So check out the companion podcast series, the 3 different levels of communications in M4P: program level, market level, and project level.
Thank you. Introduce us to some of the dilemmas that facilitators face.
So in the next section of this talk, I want to have a look at the sort of the not the introduction, but the first meaty section of the handbook, basically. And we look at 3 different areas: credibility building, actually delivering M4P, and how we share lessons. And there's communications implications for each of those. And that we've grouped it like that because there are dilemmas, I think, for M4P programs in each of those areas. So if you're doing development in a more traditional way, let's say you're building schools in Tanzania, or you're inoculating children against preventable diseases in DRC, your dilemmas are going to be different, I think, to if you're working in an M4P context, if you're working as a facilitator trying to improve market systems. So credibility building, delivering M4P, and sharing lessons are the kind of the dilemmas that we look at in the handbook.
So before we launch into kind of some of the strategic stuff, can you give us a little overview of what M4P is?
So I think when a lot of people think about M4P, they think about a donut. And often when people do training on M4P, the first thing that comes up is this donut graphic. And, I would very much recommend to you the handbook on M4P, which is produced by Springfield. They came up with the concept. They've developed it over many years, but I think what hasn't changed is this concept of the donut. So inside the donut is the market core, and in the market core you have both supply and demand. So whether that be financial services or whether that be cotton production, the core of the market is basically consumers demanding and producers supplying. Or if it's not manufacturing, if it's something else, then, perhaps it's a B2B service. Perhaps we're talking about a market for consultancy services, for example, where, there would be one type of company or organization which was demanding this consultancy services, and then another type of organization who are suppliers in that market. But those people in the core are referred to as market actors. And a key thing about a market facilitator is they are not a market actor, and I think that's really important. I'm sure we'll come back to it. The M4P sort of guidance says don't interfere in the core. Don't try and mess with supply and demand in a direct way. So one thing you could do, for example, is if you had a market, let's say the market was freshwater fish from Lake Victoria. There's an issue about that market. Perhaps the people who are catching those fish can't sell it to the right people or to the right quantity. What should you do? Should you subsidize the fish? Well, M4P would say no, because if you start to subsidize, you bring down the price of the fish to make them more acceptable. What you're doing is you're messing with the core. And the reason you shouldn't do that is because it's not sustainable. Because when we're working in development, we need to be mindful of donor funds. If we do something like that, we try and affect the market. It can only have a short-term impact. And it can also lead all sorts of other problems in associated markets or indeed in that market. So instead, M4P says work on the systems, work on the things at the top, the supporting functions, or work on the things at the bottom, the rules. So every market is constrained by rules. They might be laws, they might be regulations, they might be informal customs and practices that have shaped the way that market works. But there's also support functions to every market. So every market player has certain information. And that ranges from someone who's catching freshwater fish in Lake Victoria to someone who's doing capital markets development up the road in Kampala. The same systems and structures apply, it's just they're different, obviously. So the information that you have, when's the best time to go out and catch the fish? What's the best way to store the fish to keep them fresh for longer? What's the best way to sell them in your market? This kind of market information is key. Now, if you're doing capital markets development, the questions are different. What's happening to the stock market? What's happening to bonds? What's happening to interest rates? But structurally, it's the same thing. These are the supporting functions. So that, in a nutshell, if you like, is M4P.
And clearly there are different entry points for market systems facilitators. Each program, is at a different level. Can you speak about those levels?
Yeah, so M4P projects, M4P programs are like other development programs in one regard, in that they are project-led, project-based. And I think a lot of development programs will be like this. They'll be running project by project. A lot of think tanks are like that, research project by research project. But where M4P differs, I think, is that M4P projects have different stages. And the M4P jargon for that is AAER, which stands for Adopt, Adapt, Respond, and Expand. And these are the phases of an M4P project. So let's start in what they call the piloting phase, the Adopt and Adapt. So in the piloting phase, you'll be trying to get market actors to adopt a new type of behaviour. And at its core, M4P is essentially about trying to get people to change their minds, to think differently about how they work. So that might be a bank, for example, that at the moment is just going after its competitors' customers. They are fighting for a small bit of the market and trying to get market share from their competitors. But an M4P financial inclusion project would say, let's try and change the business model. Let's try and work down the pyramid. Let's try and get more of the unbanked into financial services. Can we encourage you to adopt a new process? Now, that might be a new product, or that might be a new way of delivering services. But the adoption phase is the sort of first phase of the piloting phase. Once that's been successful to some extent, once you've got proof of concept, if you like, then comes the adaptation phase. So having run a pilot project with some market actors, or in the market system more widely, then what you're looking for is for market actors to adapt to that and take on that success, that new innovation, and start to change their business model. Then comes the E and the R, and that is the crowding in phase. This is where what we're looking for is for not just the partner that you as an M4P program have been working with, but other market actors, the rest of the market, will start to respond. They're going to respond to the fact that a competitor has adopted and adapted and changed the way the business works. And so if the market is working healthily, competition will kick in, and the market itself will change, not just one market actor. And then finally expanding, kind of scaling up phase. So the thing about communications is, whenever you look at project level communications, it's key to be clear which stage in this M4P process is that project in. Is this an adopt project? Is this an adapt project? Now, some projects will follow all the way through, but the point at which you're looking at a project, thinking about how you're going to use communications to help it achieve its goals, it's key to know which phase that's in. And we'll come into that in a bit more detail later.
Sounds good.
So the other thing about projects is, I think it's really important that you use this principle of communications from the ground floor. And this is something that Well-Made Strategy we advocate not just to M4P programs, but to research organizations as well. So often what happens is communications is an afterthought. People think about communications once they've finished a piece of research. They think about a launch event, they think about publishing it. But we would advocate actually thinking about communications from the ground floor. And we use an elevator, a lift, as a metaphor for that. So at the planning phase, when you're deciding the objectives of a research project, or indeed a market facilitation project, when you're in inception mode, that's when you should be thinking about communications. As you're designing research or designing a project, even as you're collecting research data, or you're beginning to work with a partner on a project, it's key to be communicating. And so we kind of chart on the slide all the different levels at which you should be communicating. But traditional communications would only really kick in at sort of level 4 here. Most people would traditionally normally only communicate about something once the research is finished, once the final report is written up, once the project is over. And we actually advocate communicating from the beginning, from the ground floor, and even post, beyond the launch as well, in terms of making sure that people see the impact that your research has had, merchandising your media coverage, repeating or reheating the research, or highlighting a project which perhaps might not be running anymore, but becomes relevant because of a new innovation or a new news story, and also making sure that your monitoring and evaluation or your measuring and results measurement is communicated in public, so that you're showing the lessons that you learn as you learn them, rather than waiting for everything to conclude.
That makes sense. Can you tell me a little bit more about comms before the launch? What does that look like?
Often we'll talk to researchers about the old way of doing research, which was to go into the field with clipboards in secret and collect data to bring back to head office. Or perhaps you would go to a university library and you would do a literature review, and you would look at all the things that have been written about this topic before you write your research report. And that period of initial research was often done away from the public eye, was invisible to stakeholders, was just not clear. It was just not visible at all. Actually, we advocate making it visible. So we say, look, if you're going to do, let's say, a survey of small businesses in Zimbabwe, tell people that you're doing that. Make it visual. Use social media. Take video. Capture what this research and this data collection looks like. Show your researchers going from small business to small business. Show small business people being asked questions for this survey. If you're doing a literature review, encourage your researchers to live tweet their literature review. So literally, as they are reading and finding studies which they think they want to cite in their research, get them to tweet about it. Get them to post short posts on Facebook. What you'll find then is that the peer review process begins not at the end, but right at the beginning. So other experts in the field will find the fact that you're talking about the topic that they're also interested in interesting, and they'll engage with you. They will say, well, it's interesting that you've picked up on this study, but did you realize that there was a later study which actually moved the thinking on? Or, this point that you've picked up from this study, that's now been refuted, or there's newer data, and so on. And so actually, by doing your research in public, your peer review is beginning at the start, and that will make your research more effective, and it should make your project more effective too. Because if you start a project in a pilot phase, and actually that's already been done, it's quite useful to know about that. So telling people what you're doing and being open to their inputs can really make your program and your effectiveness more impactful. And I think when M4P people talk about adaptive management, that is a key way that communications can play a role in an adaptive management technique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see how this warms the market up to new products. And it also provides this environment where you're much more responsive to existing challenges. So it's much more participatory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's impossible to know everything that's happening in every market. But by talking about what you're doing, people will come and find you. Mm-hmm. So other people who are doing something similar, or even people who are doing something different but in a related field, can come and find you if you're being not just transparent, but actually proactive in terms of communicating about what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. Because it may be that someone's tried what you're trying already, and they can save you a lot of time and money by letting you know about it.
Absolutely.
So do it in the open. Yeah, so on this slide, I wanted to just talk about strategy, because a lot of people get confused, I think, about communication strategy. And I think it's really key to start with your objectives. And this is particularly important, I think, when you're doing project level comms. It's really important that you don't have separate communications objectives. I think a good communication strategy will take the objectives which are in your either in your log frame or in your intervention guide, and we'll work with the set objectives that the project has. And then a good communication strategy will just use communications tools and tactics to make that objective more realizable. And that, I think, is really important. So I put this slide up just to sort of show you that kind of hierarchy, that you must always start with the objectives. When you're doing it at project level, those objectives should be clear in the intervention guide. If you're doing it at program level, those objectives should be clear in your log frame. If you're doing it at market level, again, you think about what you're trying to achieve by getting into that market. But those things ought to be well set out at the beginning. Then use communication strategy to try and advance those. But don't think about communications channels, Twitter, YouTube, email, an event at a hotel, letters, reports, all those things, all those options are just tactics. Be clear on your objectives, use a strategy that is going to promote those objectives, and only get into, should we do a blog? Should we do a podcast? Should we send out an email? Only get into that as a kind of service to the strategy to support the objective. And then this is actually a table that's drawn from the handbook. The handbook goes into a lot of depth about project level communications, but I thought it'd be useful just to summarize the communication strategy that I think is sort of most appropriate for a project that's in each of these phases. So as I say, let's say you're doing that project on freshwater fish in Lake Victoria. At what phase is your project in? Are you looking at adopting or adapting? Are you looking at expanding or responding? And here I've kind of suggested what you should do. So spotlight the problem at the beginning. When you're trying to get a market actor to adopt a new innovation or process, talk about the problem. But I wouldn't talk about the solution until you get into the adapt phase. And lots of people worry and say, well, just in the piloting phase, we can't talk about what we're doing because, we've got commercial partners. They don't want to look like they've failed. They don't want to take risks in public. It's commercially sensitive. They don't want their competitors stealing their ideas. And so there were all these sort of particular M4P constraints. But I think, with sunset clauses in non-disclosure agreements, with a dialogue with partners, which sort of shows the benefits, and even thinking about, let's highlight the problem first, then let's highlight what we think might be a potential solution. Just doing that in phases, not being scared to talk about a problem and highlight a problem before you've worked out what the solution to it is. Again, I think it supports that adaptive management technique of M4P, and I think it makes good communications because you might find solutions come to you. So it's quite possible that you'll be able to convene stakeholders, do research, come up with brilliant ideas and brilliant solutions to these problems. Or you might find that just by highlighting a problem, talking about it, community leaders will come forward, fintechs, innovators, startups, people in the market you don't know about will come and bring innovative solutions and ideas to you. And then you can start to look at how do we unlock those solutions with our interventions. Mm-hmm. And then for the crowding in phase as well, using communications to encourage crowding in. I mean, I think it's impossible really for the crowding in process to happen on a project that's secret. I mean, literally, if other market actors don't know about this new business model or this new way of doing things, how are they possibly going to crowd into the market? So I think communications is key in crowding in, but it's possible that your M4P program might not be in the lead there. You might be working in partnership. You might be encouraging your partner to do that communications, or you might even be building the capacity of a partner or another market actor or another player within the market system to encourage crowding in. But I think communications is key to crowding in. And then finally, in the respond phase, telling the story of impact. And we won't go into much detail here, but again, have a look at the handbook because there's quite a big section at the end which talks about impact-oriented measurement and the need to tell a story of impact. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily to get completely hung up on attribution, can we be absolutely sure that the thing we did led to this result, but rather telling the story of impact, what you did and what happened, not tying yourself in knots about whether you can attribute your action to the output, but rather telling a story of impact and showing that different parts of the market system had to change, or different actors had to do something. But that really is about narrative, and narrative ultimately is the core of communications.
So if this is all still sounding a little high level and conceptual, the handbook does have a section on each one of these phases of implementation: adopt, adapt, expand, and respond. And so do check it out, and do listen to the podcast series that we will also be releasing soon.
So let's have a look at these credibility building dilemmas. And these, I think, really are particular to working at M4P context. And we've talked a little bit about some of them already, but let's just highlight them. So, there's a worry. I think it's impossible to be seen as credible if you're invisible. And yet so many M4P programs, I think, particularly when they start, there's a sort of nervousness about being seen to be visible. So on the one hand, they want to be credible, but on the other hand, they don't necessarily want to be high profile. They don't want to be too visible. And I think getting that balance between having enough visibility to build your credibility is absolutely key for an M4P program to be successful. There's another thing about taking credit for success. So a lot of M4P programs worry, they view their role as facilitator in a way that almost kind of removes the legitimacy of the impact that they've made. And again, I think that's a real mistake, because I think it goes to that question of credibility. I think to be a credible market facilitator, you do have to be known for success. And I think market actors and market system players want to work with a facilitator who they think has a track record of success. So if you never talk about your successes, or you don't find a way of allowing others to talk about your successes, you're going to find it very hard to build your credibility. You're going to find it very hard to be an effective and respected facilitator in a given market. And then finally, this issue of waiting for results and attribution of impact. We spoke about this a moment ago. It's the same thing, do I have to wait for the final report from my measurement and results management department before I can talk about my project? No, absolutely not. So of course MRM are going to do a baseline study, of course they're going to do an interim report, of course there's going to be a final report, but tell the story of impact, provide a narrative on what you're doing before you can conclusively prove things. Of course MRM is important, of course M&E as a reporting structure to donors is important, but try and separate that from the need to tell a story, to create a narrative of impact for the market, to build your credibility.
Mm-hmm. So you're building buy-in and participation in advance of releasing a new product, and really building your credibility through engaging people on a conversation about the problem rather than just the solution that comes out at the end.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to assert a little bit. Don't feel you have to prove everything. Now, I'm not saying, just become a sort of opinion house. I think it's really important that M4P programs are seen to be evidence-led. But don't allow a sort of high bar of academic rigor to prevent you from saying what you think. And if you've got a hypothesis, if you've got a theory, if you've got an idea, got a credible, plausible thought about something, present it in those terms. And then challenge others to disprove it. I think that's the way to go in terms of credibility building.
So I think a lot of FSD partners do struggle with how visible they should be vis-a-vis their grantees and their beneficiaries. Could you talk about that dilemma between being high profile or allowing others to shine that you're facilitating?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've called this the sort of low ego versus low profile dilemma. And it really comes from my work with FSD Africa. And in the handbook, there's a case study box which tells the story of FSD Africa's sort of journey on communications. And right at the heart of it, actually, was the fact that when I found them, they were very clear that they wanted to have a low ego brand. And it took me some time to sort of understand what they meant by a low ego brand. But I felt that a lot of the staff and a lot of the people that they were working with were interpreting that as a low profile brand. That actually what they wanted to do was keep their heads down, work in the shadows, be invisible, not just not take a leading role, but almost like if they could achieve things and do things without anyone even knowing they'd been there, that was what success looked like. And I think eventually I convinced them that there's a difference between low ego and low profile. So I think you can have a low ego brand which is still high profile. And what do I mean by that? So I mean that your high profile brand doesn't crowd out the brands of your partners. So you're willing to work in partnership with one another. That's what makes it low ego. Also, that you don't have to be in the lead on every project. So, if you're working with a bank, or you're working with the UNHCR or something like that in terms of refugee finance, allowing those partners to be at the forefront is good low ego work. But if you don't get a mention at all, if your role is completely airbrushed from history, then I think you've crossed the line into sort of counterproductive low profile. So I think it's important to have a profile for your projects at project level. I think it's important for you to have a profile in individual markets. But even at program level, I think it's really important that you're professional about your communications, that your website showcases you at your best, that you regularly communicating to people, whether that be email or whatever the appropriate channel is to connect to your stakeholders. You are providing evidence that you are affected and trusted, and that builds your credibility. And I just don't think you can do that with a low profile. So I would say, yes, have a low ego brand, but do not try and achieve with a low profile brand, because I think market facilitation at its core is about changing people's minds. Mm-hmm. And that means advancing arguments, and arguments have to come from places. And actually the credibility of you in terms of even just hosting an argument, even sort of commissioning a researcher or bringing in an expert from a different country into a particular field, the fact that you are bringing that person, your credibility rubs off on them. So yes, their expertise then rubs off on you as well. But again, this is about the difference between profile and ego. And then there's another set of dilemmas that we look at in the handbook, and broadly we've called them delivering M4P. And obviously these are very unique to M4P programs, but we find them a lot. This dilemma about whether you can communicate in the diagnostic phase, and just going back to what I was saying about the 2 A's in the project cycle: adaptation and adoption. Even before you begin a project, when you are diagnosing, I think talking about the problem, scoping the problem, because I think it's important, if you're going to be effective, that your understanding of the problem is correct. Now that is contestable, but don't think that you can sit in your office and go through piles of data, or even just use Google to give you that accurate analysis of diagnostics. So I think good M4P programs will engage with stakeholders, but I also think it's important to talk about your diagnosis in public, because again, you will then find that there are people in the market, or there are people in the market system who have thought about these issues as well, but you won't necessarily know who they are. So allow them to come and find you by attaching yourself to the problem, publicly attaching yourself to the problem that you're interested in solving. So yes, I definitely think you should communicate in the diagnostic phase. And then again, this issue about whether you need to wait and see whether your research is concluded before you tell anyone about it. I mean, I don't need to restate my position on this. You know the view. That's not particular, I don't think, to M4P. But I do think that M4P programs, I think because of the way they They view trying to affect the information function in the support function around the donut. Often tie themselves in knots about this. And I think actually the thing to do is to look to the wider research community. And if you look at academic institutions that are effective, if you look at think tanks that are effective, they are the ones that communicate about their research. They're not the ones that just publish inaccessible research projects that take months and months or years and years. They are the ones where that professor is always on TV, that professor is heard on the radio, that think tank is always convening events with politicians. They're talking about issues, not just publishing research. And again, I think that's something to learn from. And then finally, what if a project fails? I think this is another, this is more of a sort of development dilemma, I think. And I think this is where market facilitators need to be bold and brave, because I think if you are delivering a traditional development project, let's say you're providing emergency food aid, or let's say you're providing contraception, or let's say you're providing maternal health clinic. I mean, if you fail as a service delivery provider, it's not good, right? It does not look good at all. But if you fail if one of your projects fails as a market facilitator, in some ways, that's quite a good thing, because you will, as long as you learn from that, as long as you take those lessons on board, as long as you use those adaptive management techniques, and you use that failed project as part of a portfolio of projects, and you use it to increase your learning. In some ways, if none of your projects fail, your program, absolutely, your program has not taken enough risks, and if none of your projects fail, you're just doing stuff that's too safe. Now that's different if you are delivering a direct service for a development program. But if you're a market facilitator, be wary of failure, but don't be afraid of failure. And actually,
it's important to know what doesn't work too. That's incredibly important information. So I love this metaphor that well-made strategy uses, basically to sum up what you've said. It's the submarine strategy. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I think I used this metaphor first in Lusaka when I was doing some work with FSD Zambia, and I almost had it as a kind of throwaway remark. I had a single slide with a picture of a submarine, and I said a lot of think tanks that I work with in the UK, they adopt this submarine strategy, and it's a kind of they don't do it deliberately. It's a sort of default thing that happens to an organisation, especially if they're researching. Their staffs just kind of disappear. They submerge. They go into the university library to do the literature review, or they go into the field to collect their primary research. Then they come back and they write up their notes, and they're just completely invisible. And then all of a sudden, they burst to the surface with a 100-page research report, with 20 recommendations, with a massive data set, and people just can't
absorb it.
Yeah.
And they have no idea where it came from.
Yeah. And then the submarine is gone. It disappears. It goes back down to the bottom of the ocean again, because the researchers are then working on the next research project. And then some months, maybe even years later, they pop up again. And this seemed to resonate with FSD Zambia in their very early phase. I have to say, I now think FSD Zambia are a kind of a perfect case study in how a program doesn't use the submarine strategy and fights tooth and nail against it, and is constantly visible and talking about their work. But this idea, sometimes I think in strategy it's a good idea not just to talk about what you're trying to achieve, but what you're trying to avoid. And the submarine strategy, if you like, is the model for failure. And we see it not just in M4P programs, but we see it in other development programs too. And so knowing what you want to prevent or avoid is an important part of comm strategy. And that's where I think the submarine
and you'll be talking about the opposite of the submarine strategy a little bit later.
Yeah. So finally, the dilemmas on lesson learning. This is something that I think we explore in the podcast series too. It's something that the Well Told Story Insights podcast series has explored too. This idea that, how do you do communications about your lesson learning? Isn't it the case that donors only really want to know about success? Well, actually, what we're finding is that donors are becoming more and more sophisticated. That actually what donors want are not projects that just say, yes, we can do that. Yes, no problem. Actually, they like projects that push back. They like grantees that say, look, it's more complicated. You as a donor, you've got this very simplistic objective, but actually it's much more complicated than that. Our knowledge of this market, our understanding of these processes tell us that it's much more complicated than that. And actually what you're asking us to do is not achievable. Instead, this is a more realistic objective, or instead, this is a more realistic project or proposal. And donors respond really, really well to that. You think that donors sit there, sitting on a massive checkbook or a pile of cash, just thinking about what they want to achieve. And in some senses they do, but really what they want is a back and forth with grantees. They want a dialogue with grantees because ultimately they want to change the world. And when donors get really frustrated is when you lead them to think that everything you're going to do is a success, or that the way they've asked you to do something can be perfectly delivered. They like realism. They like pushback. They like dialogue. And that goes to the heart of lesson learning. I think there are a lot of donors now who in some ways are happier to have funded a project that has failed and learned than they are to fund a project which has succeeded, but they're not really sure if they believe the success because they don't really buy the impact assessment, or they're not really sure about the attribution, or the grantee has taken the money and has reported the outcome, but they're not really sure that this is replicable elsewhere. And so lesson learning dilemma, I think, is key, is talk about it. And talk about it with your donors in private, but also do as much as you can to talk about that impact narrative in public. Because you might find that you get other donors too, and that other donors want to come and work with you. There's another one, which is if we share what we really know, can we put our funding at risk? I guess that's the same associated thing. And that don't we need to be 100% sure that what we did resulted in pro-poor market change? Well, again, long section in the handbook about impact-oriented measurement. I think it's important not to get tied up in knots about attribution, but instead create a narrative of impact and talk about change, and not worry too much exactly where that change happened. Just posit a hypothesis if you can't prove it.
And then you talk about the bolt-on approach as something not to do.
Yeah, it's another example really of a strategy in reverse. And again, it came from my sort of early engagement with FSD Kenya back in 2014. And again, I would say FSD Kenya now are a model example of how they don't do the bolt-on approach. But back then, I think there was a sense in which they were doing a lot of projects. They were very active in several markets in Kenya, but their communications was siloed. They had one communications coordinator. He was relatively junior. He was in the sort of operations division. He was very separate from the technical staff. And the technical staff went and spoke to him at the end of a project when they had something to publish. So if they had a valuation, or if they had a research project which they wanted to publish, they would go to him. He had no visibility really on what projects we're trying to achieve. He was not in at the ground floor. He was not in a discussion about inception. He was not in a discussion about objectives. And it didn't work. It really, really didn't work. He literally bolted on communications at the end of these projects. And I don't think the technical staff found it very effective. And I know that he didn't enjoy working in that. And to be fair to FSD Kenya's leadership, they did a big strategic communications review with Oil Story. They changed their staffing. They also changed, most importantly, I think, the structure of their staffing. And now their communications manager works hand in glove with the technical staff there, uses communications from the ground floor, and is in on those conversations about what's the objective here, when you're putting a project together, how we're going to use communications to make that project impactful. And so the relationship is much, much better.
Mm-hmm. So I think, you really convinced us that we've got to communicate right from the beginning consistently, and that it shouldn't be just one person. It's an organizational activity. So practically speaking, how do you plan out or manage this process of communicating consistently?
So on the slide now, you'll see a communications grid, and this is a made up one, but it's indicative really, and this shows a month on a page, and this is what a good strategic communications manager, I think, manages. That this is a sort of standing item on team meetings, that this communications grid is accessible and seen by technical staff, and there's an ongoing conversation about how to organise external communications. So it's a month on a page. You'll see each column is a week within that month, and then each row down the left-hand side is a different sort of market or a different pillar to the program's communications. And what this is great at is giving you a visual sense of space and time, so that you can see from your audience's perspective, from your from the recipients of your communications, how much is coming out from you. So in some ways, what you can see where the submarine is going to submerge, and you literally just look for the gaps. So on this one, you can see in week 3, it's blank. But in week 1, there are 3 different things happening. So a very simple thing here is just to try and take 1 or 2 of the things out of week 1 and push them into week 3 to try and give you a more consistent and less sort of bumpy communications output. The objective here should be try and keep that submarine at the top of the ocean, visible, constant, always there. Don't let it submerge. But then also you can see the topics on which you would go silent on. So again, in this example, if you look at the line on insurance, you'll see that row is completely blank. So for a whole month, this made-up organisation in this made-up month is not going to say anything about insurance. Now that's a problem, because that's for a certain market, the insurance providers, insurance sector, your submarine looks like it's going to the bottom of the ocean, and that's a problem. So the grid is great because it gives you a sort of visual representation, and you can see the bottlenecks, you can see if people are going to be overstretched, you can see what your deadlines are, how long you've got until something goes live, but also you can see where the submarine is going to submerge, and by reordering things in the grid, you can keep constantly at the surface.
And if you look at the top row, you're also pegging all your activities with external activities. And so, for example, you've got International Women's Day, and so you know that there's appropriate output that's going out during that week, and you can actually leverage what's happening in the world to promote what you need to be promoting. Yeah,
that line is super useful because it keeps you relevant. So there are things that are going to be conversations anyway. How can you connect your program to relevant things? And before anybody writes in, we know International Women's Day is not the last week in January, but we just put it there as an example. The other thing I think is on the right-hand column, you see a TBC line. I think operationally this is super useful because often you'll find out that something's gonna happen, but you don't know exactly what day it's going to happen. So you know there's going to be a conference in January, but you don't know until the end of December actually which day in January that's going to be. So if you put things into your TBC or to be confirmed column, when you know about them, you can migrate them and move them across and put them into a dated week or even day nearer the time.
So, and I think internally it's also makes things easier because everyone knows what they need to do. It seems less overwhelming. If Tim knows he needs to publish a blog in week 1, he knows that he's done what he needs to do, and the rest of the team then understands that they can tweet about that blog and disseminate it to their networks.
And then there shouldn't be any surprises as well for your colleagues. That it's not just the communications person who has visibility on what's coming up or just keeps a production schedule. Here, people know what to expect. So they know what's expected of them, but they also know what to expect from their colleagues. So if they're going out and they're having a meeting with stakeholders, they know that in a couple of weeks, something is being published or something is coming out which is relevant to those stakeholders, so they can, warm them up or have that conversation, in that knowledge and not be in the dark.
Yeah, I think with the partners I've worked with, they found this tool to be incredibly useful. And in fact, a lot of organizations will have this pinned up on a wall in their meeting room. And it is a management tool, not just for the comms person, but for the CEO and for program managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's not just helpful for M4P. I mean, this is used pretty universally in government communications, certainly in Europe and America. And some people are so enthusiastic about adopting this tool. I once saw, the FSD will remain nameless, but I went and visited their office, and they had drawn their grid on a whiteboard, which I thought was fantastic. And so everybody in the open plan office could see the grid that was on the whiteboard. And then I looked at the dates slightly closer, and I noticed that they were some weeks ago, and I said, "Oh, you haven't, updated your what?" And they said, "No. What happened was someone used permanent marker." on the whiteboard. So eventually they managed to get that down. But I do think having this visible, whether it's on a whiteboard in the office or whether it's on a shared drive, and I think having it discussed regularly at team meetings as well is really helpful. So keeping it visible, making it a conversation, moving things around, putting intelligence in there when you find out about it, it's a really, really helpful tool.
Yeah, and as a team, just sitting together, having this up on the wall, and then you get your sticky notes out. Each person plugs in what they intend on doing that month.
Yeah, it's a bit more participatory as well.
And it doesn't take a very long time. So what you're really talking about is the whole organization communicating like an orchestra.
Yeah, absolutely. And this picture is the Kinshasa Orchestra from DRC. And, it's a wonderful picture, but it's a sort of visual metaphor, really. My view is that communications is too important to leave to the communications specialists. And so I try and use this visual metaphor to argue, not just for M4P programs, but for development programs more widely, that actually everybody on the team needs to be communicating. Yes, the communications specialist plays a particular role, but I put this up once and someone said, "Oh, so I guess you're the conductor of this orchestra." And actually, no, I think if anything, the communications specialist is right at the back in the percussion section, keeping the beat. But what people want to hear from the orchestra is the solo from the violin or the string section or the moment where the horns take their part. Actually, that's what the planning grid does, is it gives space for the different areas of expertise and the nuance. So, if you imagine in this sort of metaphor that, the strings or the horns are actually the sort of the SME finance specialists or the rural finance specialists, that's how you get the best out of your M4P program, by giving different specialists the time and space to show their expertise, but making sure that the nuance of it is comes through. Bankers don't want to hear from the communications coordinator. They want to meet the digital finance specialist. On TV as well, they want your CEO. They want to see that you take this seriously. Or, on a particular topic, they want the best expert. So actually communications is a group activity, but it does need a bit of organising and coordinating, and that's where I think the planning grid comes in handy, and that's where I think the orchestra metaphor works well.
I love it. Let's talk specifically about research and how you go about disseminating research.
Yes, I think this is important for M4P because information is an important aspect of the supporting structure, the top of the donut, if you like, in M4P jargon. But the worry is that you'll fall into the submarine strategy, and actually what you'll do is you'll do your research in secret and private and then pop up later. So I think in terms of practitioners that I've worked with, Senfree and the Eye-to-Eye facility in Cape Town, they work all over Asia and Africa. They were very much using that approach, not deliberately, but by default. And they were using it because they had such in-depth and powerful research methodologies. So they have a thing called MAP, which is Making Access Possible, which I think they do in partnership with UNCDF. And MAP culminates in a 200-page document, which is very, very data heavy. And so they've done map in Myanmar, and they've done map in Zambia and so on, and they do it country by country. And I talked to them about a different way of doing this. I talked to them about communicating as they go, communicating as they collect that research. But also, in order to get people to read that 200-page document, providing a what I call a pyramid of engagement. And that is a series of communications outputs which support the bigger, weightier foundation, if you like, of the project. So here in this pyramid of engagement, at the bottom, we have the full report, which is often pegged to a launch event. So really important to say, I'm not arguing against launch events, but I think we've all been to a lot of launch events. Here in Kenya, go to a breakfast at the Serena, a big document is launched. It takes you an hour to get there. It takes an hour or two at the event. It takes an hour to get to where you want to go afterwards. That's basically half your day. Then they give you a document. It might be 40, 50, 60 pages. It's going to take an hour or two to read. You're asking for a very deep level of engagement. So I think to get more people to that commitment, it's a good idea to ask them for a more superficial level of engagement, to create what I call bite-sized chunks. And social media is a good way to do that. News coverage is a good way to do that. Or writing short articles is a good way to do that. But I think the thing about digital communications is that now we have this world of possibility. So that the digital options in the pyramid of engagement are huge. And they include, wait for it, webinars like this, or podcasts like the podcast series that we've created. So using the pyramid of engagement, I think, is a really good tool if you have a big, weighty research project, particularly if it's going to be launched at a sort of key moment launch event. And I'll give some practical examples of that using FSD Africa.
Yeah, and just to build on that, it's at the top of the pyramid, you've got a retweet, which requires the least amount of effort and has the most amount of access. Mm-hmm. And then at the bottom of the pyramid, you've got, weekend festival or roundtable seminar, which is incredibly resource intensive and has the most amount of information. So really, you're trying to kind of funnel the most amount of access towards the most detailed information as and when people need that information.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people are time poor, they want to interact, they can just retweet something, or they could compose their own tweet. These things take, a matter of sometimes seconds, maybe minutes, but they certainly don't take certainly don't take an hour. But equally, I think, and we talk a bit about this on the podcast series, I think there's a sense in which if you want to be a really good market facilitator, you need convening power. And the best way to get convening power is to avoid business as usual events. So, those breakfasts at hotels, which everybody does, in capital cities right around the continent, everybody launches research at breakfast events at hotels. But I think if you convene people and you bring them to what I'd call a non-business as usual event, it transforms the way that people engage with you. Now, these can actually be quite resource intensive and can take more time, but I think participants find them so much more rewarding. And I think a brilliant example of that is what FSD Tanzania do in terms of their FinDisrupt events. Now, these are residential events. They take people out of Dar es Salaam, they go to a local market, they engage in field research with the local market. They really get to understand and get to know people on the coast or in the upcountry, and then they get these fintechs to brainstorm solutions to the problems. And then on the final day, they bring the community back and they have a kind of Dragon's Den style pitch. And in the middle of that, they look at all the research as well. And, that takes a lot of time. I think the FinDisrupt events are brilliant, perfect example of non-business as usual events. Memorable. They're so memorable and they build the convening power of FSDT. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to give you some examples of the pyramid of engagement in action, just to show that, look, I might have conceptualized it with a pyramid, but I certainly didn't come up with the idea. So CGAP, very high profile. That is the sort of think tank for financial inclusion of the World Bank. They have a lot of resources, but they've were using these tools from the get-go. In 2014, when I first came into contact with FSD Africa and the wider FSD network, CGAP already had a social media channel. They were already publishing regular blogs. They were using the social media channel to push that content, which was the blog. And what that blog was about was a big, heavy, weighty piece of research. So I'm absolutely not arguing against big, heavy, weighty pieces of research. I'm just saying fill in more of the rungs of the pyramid of engagement. And again, there's an example there of them using email. So, this was the model I used for FSD Africa. And then FSD Africa have become the model for other FSDs. And I think the FSD network is becoming the model for other M4P programs, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but right around the world, the developing world. So again, social media, pushing accessible content, using accessible channels, social media or email, and pushing accessible content. If we look at the next slide, you'll see some other examples of accessible content. So these are videos from CGAP's website. They have some really interesting people who come through town in Washington. They capture them on video. They push that accessible content out through those accessible channels. FSD Zambia did something similar with audio, where they had consultants who were writing research reports, and when they came to Lusaka for the launches, the communications team there recorded them in audio form talking about their research. So yes, you could come to the launch event. Yes, you could read the full report. But if you just want a little appetizer, a bite-sized chunk, here's a 10, 15, 20-minute podcast that you could listen to, or here's a 600, 700, 800-word blog post you could read. And really, that is the approach we're using to promote this handbook. So we're living our values. We're using the advice that we're giving.
Yeah. So in addition to this audio seminar, we are also going to be publishing a series of podcasts that will look at strategic communications at all three levels: the program level, the market level, and the project level. And we're going to be publishing a series of blogs to accompany them.
Yeah. While I'm advising people to be strategic at every level, I think it's also worth talking about what strategy means. Now, maybe more than halfway through the talk, this is a bit late to get into this. But again, I think sometimes people can be a bit confused about what a strategy is. And I think every strategy has to answer 4 questions, basically. It has to answer the question, where are we? It has to have a situational analysis. Every strategy has to start from somewhere. And you have to have an aim about where you want to be. You have to have objectives in that strategy. Then you have to have a sense of how you get there. And for me, that is what a strategy is. But you can't come up with how do we get there unless you have a clear and shared understanding of where are we and where do we want to be. So in an ideal world, the CEO would be able to answer those first 2 questions with complete clarity. But actually the process of strategizing, of putting a strategy together, of making sure that the CEO's vision is shared by the rest of the team, of making sure that that stands the test of external scrutiny and that stakeholders are on board with that as well is crucial. And then finally, a strategy has to be able to answer the question, how will we know if we've arrived? How will we measure those objectives? So if that's what a strategy is, how do you do strategic planning? What's the order in which you think? And again, we've seen a bit of this before, but it's really important to do this in the right order, starting with your objective or what action do you want a certain stakeholder to take or a certain market, a piece of the market system. How do you want them to act differently? What's the objective here? And then each action needs an actor, or in communications terms, we call them an audience. So who is it that you need to speak to achieve that objective, or which actor could take that action? Then you need to develop a message to deliver to that audience to achieve that objective, or an ask, if you like, for that actor to take that action. And only then, once you've answered those 3 questions, should you think about the tactics of communications implementation. So what content are you going to create and what channel are you going to use to deliver that? But that has to be determined by the message, which is tailored to the audience, which is designed to achieve an objective. And if you get those things in the wrong order, your strategic planning will go haywire. And that, I think, is one reason why communications has a bad name. And I think it does, to be honest. I think communications does have a bad reputation, not just in Africa, but I think in the world of international development traditionally, because people they either saw communications as a bolt-on, like we talked about, or they saw it as a sort of a kind of a sort of indulgence, you know.
Yeah, we're throwing seeds into the wind. You're not sure, I'm writing these case studies and...
Yeah, but what's it for?
Yeah, writing these reports. Is anyone actually reading them? Are they creating the impact that I want?
Yeah. So measuring your impact's key. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing about a case study is you'll have the confidence to write the case study if you've decided what message the case study is going to deliver, who it's going to the audience, and what you want that person, that audience, that actor to think differently or even do differently as a result of reading your case study. So it has a purpose. Communication's for a purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes strategy also gets a bad name because people assume that it's a very lengthy process and you've got this big fat document that then sits in on a shelf somewhere. But if you really break it down into objective strategy tactics, your objective can be that one-liner, the policy change that you want to create. And then the strategy being like, who is it that you want to target in order to have that strategy be enforced. And then the tactic being, it could be as simple as an important meeting or important phone call that needs to take place. But just having that clarity about what it is that you want to get done is the number one prerequisite to the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought I'd put a slide up, just talk about what happens when planning goes wrong. Here you can see that, we don't have an objective column, but we do have an audience column and we do have a message column. But the problem is that the thinking in the channel column has been really, really constrained. So if you look at it, basically what we're going to do is a launch event, a press release, and a bit of Twitter. And I think it's really important to keep an open mind on communications channels and not think about what you can do, but think about what the logic of your planning does. So having worked out your objective, your audience, and your message, don't think what of the available options of the things we've done in the past are most appropriate now. Instead, think, what is humanly possible? What is the best way to get that message to that audience to achieve that objective? And if you've never, ever done that before, or you've never, ever used that channel before, or you don't even know how to start, take that as a signal that this is the time to innovate in your communications, because that's what will be most effective. So don't constrain yourselves to channels or content that you know how to create or that you've created in the past. Keep a really open mind when you're doing the planning process. And I think another key bit of advice, and we talk a bit about this in the podcast when we talk about the market level communications, is to communicate like you're in a relationship. Remember, we're calling them actors or audiences but these are people. Ultimately, these are people. This is people talking to people. And so communicating like you're in a relationship, I think, can be really, really beneficial. And in terms of, events as well, thinking about using people's time well. We talked a little bit about business as usual events. I think the key thing is, don't be worried about asking people to give up too much time, but make sure that you use their time effectively and that they go away from that event thinking, gosh, that's not like an event that I've been to before. And interactivity, I think, is key. And that's, if you communicate in a relationship, relationships are interactive. Okay. Our family relationships, our friends, they're interactive. We don't broadcast, we don't dominate. Those kind of relationships don't last. And so the same for institutions and the same for work as well. Let people have their say as well as telling them what you think.
What's going on in this slide?
So this is a picture I took. It's a swimming pool at a hotel at a conference in Lusaka. It was a conference about savings groups. And at the end of a very long day at the conference, there was a cocktail party, which was in the garden by the swimming pool. And I got there a little bit early, partly because I'd had a long day inside the hotel without any fresh air or anything. So I got to the cocktail party, and they had the stacks of briefing notes. The sponsors of the cocktail reception had stacks of briefing notes, all about their work, on a table as you entered. And I picked one up, but I realised that I'd just been at this conference. I needed to let off some steam. I needed some downtime. I wanted some fresh air and a drink. I mean, the cocktail party was perfectly timed in terms of my participation at the conference, but a policy brief at that moment was just the worst.
The last thing you wanted to see.
A cocktail in one hand, policy brief in the other hand. I just wanted to meet people and network, and as if by magic, a huge gust of wind, picked up these stacks of policy briefs and liberally distributed them across the swimming pool. So this is a picture of the lady from the hotel literally fishing out the policy briefs from the swimming pool. And for me, this created a sort of visual metaphor of thinking about communicating in a relationship. They hadn't thought, what
are people going to be receptive to in this moment?
Exactly.
And what should that moment be best used for?
Yeah. And then this picture of a razor is, again, a sort of visual metaphor for why I think using emotion in communications is important. Yes, M4P programs are evidence-based. Yes, being a market facilitator is about facts and is about data and is about market intelligence. But at the same level, this is people talking to people, and emotion does play a role. And I think the advertising industry know this brilliantly. If I buy this razor, I take this razor home and I tell my wife, I bought a new razor. I spent a bit more on it than I would normally have done for my old razor, but it's really good. It's really efficient. It has three blades. It's gonna be really efficient. It's gonna save me time. It's gonna shave my face very close. It's gonna be that is the rational reason that I am sort of justifying my purchase. But actually, I bought it because it's blue. I've got this product is also eliciting an emotional response for me, but I need the rational reason to justify why I'm doing it. And I think M4P is just the same. I think you will find people in banks, people in the private sector who have in their heart a development mission, who want markets to be more pro-poor. They don't like the system as it is. Emotionally, they're already bought in. But they need the rational argument to persuade their bosses. They need the business case to show their organisation. They need these people. You'll find them in private sector institutions. They're kind of rebels, really, banking rebels, we call them. Find someone in the bank who's not happy about the bank's current business model, and almost always that is because of an emotional response rather than a rational one. What they need is to work with you as a partner, whereby you can find the rational arguments that help them convince their colleagues to do what emotionally they're already bought into. So I wanted to end with a case study, and we'll rattle through this. But this is an FSD Africa case study, but I think it's interesting because it works on lots of different levels. It's about FSD Africa's research on UK to Africa remittances. But it works on the three levels that we've talked about, the three levels that we go into more detail on in the podcast series. The project level, it's about information. It's a research project. The market level, it's about the remittances market, which is a market that FSD Africa hadn't really worked on that much before. And so it was a market they wanted to create relationships in. And it also works on the program level because remittances was a particular focus for DFID, FSD Africa's donor, and they wanted to be responsive to that. So the project works on all three levels. First thing to say was it was a 100-page research report. And it was done by consultants. It was very in-depth. There was lots in it. But right at the start there, what you've got is the base of the pyramid, the pyramid of engagement, not the financial inclusion pyramid. The base of the pyramid of engagement, a 100-page report, lots of in-depth things. So immediately what I'm thinking is two things. How do I stop this being a moment where the submarine bursts to the surface and says, here's a 100-page report? So the first thing I want to do is try and spread this out. So I work with FSD Africa on a plan, a dissemination plan that's not going to be just one launch event, but it's going to last 6 months. And it's going to be a conversation with the remittances market globally at a series of events, using a series of communications tools. So I write them a 6-month grid, and we start to plot in different events and different channels. So first we have a soft launch before the report is actually ready. Then we have a global launch. Then we have launches at different conferences around the world. And we try and do media when it's appropriate for different national markets. And that stretches us out over 6 months. In terms of outputs, so imagine this is that pyramid that I was talking about. There's a Twitter campaign with a hashtag. It runs for 6 months, so you can catch up. There's an infographic series as well. It's a bit more in depth than social media, but it's not as hardcore as having to read the 100-page report. We do media relations, but we do them differently in 9 different countries, because different country media are interested in different things, but they're talking to national markets. We do a blog post series as well, which we stretch out. And then we do an accessible 6-page brochure, which we print out in hard copy and goes on tour to the different conferences around the world. And then we set up presentations to these major industry conferences, because what we realize about the remittances market is that globally, there's a conference circuit, and that conference circuit they are on, basically. So if we present at those conferences, if we find spaces at those conferences, that's the best way to be able to talk to what is a global market. So here's some examples of the infographic series. And the infographics we designed with different audiences in mind. So this is the one that was aimed at an industry audience. It sort of breaks down the proportion of costs, and we use a pound coin to symbolize that in terms of percentages. And really what you're looking at is 2 pie charts, but we've just graphically designed them. That is for the industry audience. Then there was a donor audience as well, and we knew that they were particularly interested in fragile and conflict-affected states. So though we had data for every single country in Africa in terms of UK remittances, we wanted to highlight the countries that donors had a particular focus on. So we looked at fragile and conflict-affected states. Then we had a more general audience. And yes, we had presence in the FSD country markets, but we also wanted to highlight the other markets where it was either particularly expensive or particularly cheap. So we wanted to take the outliers. We had a global figure or an overall figure for the average amount that it costs to send money from the UK to Africa. But we found country by country, there was a lot of difference. And actually, that's where the interest came, country by country. So we did a map of sub-Saharan Africa and we highlighted the particular countries. And then we made individual infographics for each country. And we did that in partnership with the different FSDs. So this is the one we did with FSD Zambia. It shows the cost of sending money to Zambia, shows the number of Zambian diaspora living in the UK, and it shows the amount of money sent each year from the UK to Zambia. And the contact details are not for FSD Africa, they're for FSD Zambia, the local partner in that country market.
And can you share where these infographics were used?
Yeah, so we use these on social media. We also embedded them in emails, and the different country programs use them themselves as well. So we basically created this for FSD Zambia to use with their stakeholders and their audience. But we did that over multiple countries.
Very nice.
And so here's the impact of the project. So we had 30 different media hits. So those 6 different country level media strategies at different times, but delivered coverage for us in 5 different countries, 30 different media hits. BBC Africa radio feature, which I think was actually recorded in London, but featured people from across the continent and went out all over. We got slots to present at conferences that we hadn't targeted, because people saw the coverage and saw presentations at other conferences and then came and asked if we would present at that conference. We had really good stakeholder engagement on social media, particularly with donors, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And by talking about the problem, we were able to generate meetings with the people that mattered. So FSD Africa used this as an introduction for them to the remittances world, and were able to secure really high-level meetings, with face-to-face meetings with industry and regulator regulator stakeholders who, if they'd have just cold called or sent a letter to, would not have opened the door, would not have shared their time. So by communicating and talking about the problem, they were able to get those meetings. And then there was also a quote from the select committee chair in the UK, which politically was quite significant for the donor in the UK. Here's an example of that donor engagement. So Annabelle Jerry, who was not someone that FSD Africa had any contact with, she's the country the country director for DFID, based I think in South Africa, but covers both South Africa and Zimbabwe. And she retweeted a infographic that we made, which showed the cost of sending money to southern African states, basically. So because we'd created an infographic which compared the costs between two of the countries in which she worked, that spoke to her directly. And so she shared it with her followers and engaged with it. Then we saw another thing that this same person, Annabella, had tweeted, and she had actually cropped another one of our infographics and got Zimbabwe and South Africa together. So she'd personalised the infographic that we made to speak to her own interests and most importantly, the interests of her followers on Twitter. So because we created a digital product that was adaptable, she was able to adapt it and then use it to build a relationship with her stakeholders. And to have someone as influential as her doing that with FSD Africa's research was just brilliant for their credibility and for their convening power.
So far greater reach than having a 100-page report that gets sent out in the mail.
Absolutely. But of course, the 100-page report made possible the communications plan and the communications campaign, if you like. But by doing research in public, by creating a conversation, by stretching things out, by using the pyramid of engagement, by giving people bite-sized chunks, all these techniques we've talked about that are written up in the handbook, we were able to achieve the objectives of the project and achieve FSD Africa's objectives in terms of introducing themselves to a new market and building credibility at program level. So at all three levels of comms for M4P, FSD Africa, using the techniques in the handbook, were able to achieve.
Very, very nice.
I think, I've just shown you what I think are the successes of a communications campaign. But the M&E department were not involved in that. I didn't have to create a baseline study or an interim report or wait for a final report. What I've shown you is I've given you a narrative of impact. I've given you the story of impact, and I've shown you what I think one thing led to another. And I've been honest about what worked. Not everything worked at all, but we've done that using what we call an after-action review. And I think sometimes we feel like we're on a hamster wheel. Sometimes as communications professionals, we feel like we're just running, we're constantly communicating, but we don't really know if we're moving things forward. I think an after-action review with your technical staff is a really good way to see whether you had impact, because you base it on what you were trying to achieve. So an after-action review basically has 4 parts. It's two halves of a conversation. There's 4 different sections to it. So to begin with, you ask all the participants what was supposed to happen. So, we had a plan. What were we trying to achieve? Then we say what actually happened. And almost always there'd be a difference between what actually happened and what we were trying to achieve. And sometimes that's not always negative. So it's not just, we were trying to achieve certain things and we fell short in certain areas, but sometimes you achieve things that you didn't set out to achieve. So that's part of that conversation around agreed facts about what actually happened. And doing that collectively as a group of everybody who's involved in the effort, I think can be really effective. Then comes the learning part. Then we talk about why there was a difference. So why was it that we achieved something that we didn't intend to achieve? What can we learn from that and do differently next time? What practices can we take forward? So what will we do next time that we didn't do last time? What will we not bother doing next time that we did this time that didn't work? And actually what we did was we did an after-action review on another project that we did with FSD Africa, and that really informed the work that we did on remittances. And so actually having after action reviews as part of a feedback loop and learning from your communications as you go is so much more effective than waiting for M&E or MRM or whatever. So what comms needs for monitoring and evaluation is tight feedback loops. And the best way to create tight feedback loops is to do after action reviews after every significant bit of action. So every time you send an email out, get people who contributed to the email together. Look at what MailChimp is telling you in terms of the impact, the open rates, the click rates. Think to yourself, did we use the best subject line for that? Did we send it from the right person? Did we send it at the right time of day? Did we send it the right day of the week? And once you start to do that every time, your feedback loop gets tighter and tighter. Mm-hmm. You get better and better, and your impact gets more and more successful. But you don't wait for a long evaluation. You do it after each and every significant action. And the other key thing about after action reviews, I think, is that there are some tips for after action reviews. The discipline comes actually from the military. And one of the things they say is you leave your stripes at the door. So in an after action review, everybody is equal. And it's really important to have an open conversation about what happened and what didn't. And once you get into the culture of after action reviews, what you'll find is that you start to preempt the after action review. So in your planning phase, when you're having a discussion about what you're going to do, you think about what you're going to say in the after action review if that doesn't go right. And so actually you're pulling forward the evaluative conversations into the planning phase rather than pushing them out into the, we'll just see if that works or not. Instead you go, look, I'm concerned. I'm not sure that's going to work based on what we've done before. Or my theory is if we do that, then such and such is going to happen. That just leads to more intelligent decision making. But it requires an environment of trust where you leave your stripes at the door, everybody's equal, and it's not judgmental. It's about learning lessons, and it's just about improving the process.
Yeah, it's a really simple and incredibly impactful tool that you can literally use in a 5-minute rehash or have a longer meeting about a larger event. And just putting this slide up on the wall facilitates that.
Yeah,
it's not complicated.
That 4-part discussion. Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, it's just about getting things in the right order. Yeah, and there's some myths about after action reviews. It can be a meeting, but it doesn't have to be a meeting. It's not a bad idea to write it up, but you shouldn't think of it as just a report. And it's not a post-mortem, right? It's not like someone died, right? A post-mortem happens where if someone dies, you find out what it was that killed them by having a post-mortem. This is not about looking at something that went wrong or even looking at something that went really well. This is just about looking at something that we did, an action that we took. And in the round, thinking, what could we have done better?
How are we going to do it better next time?
How can we do it better next time? And I do like this quote about that an AAR is more of a verb than a noun. It's a living, pervasive process that explicitly connects past actions to future actions. And this is what I mean about culture. So if you have after action review as part of your culture, you'll start to preempt them, and your decision making at the beginning will get better. It'd be more of a verb than a noun.
Okay, I think we've gone full circle. The handbook has very concrete tools in it, like the after action review, like the grid, and also kind of goes through the more strategic applications of communications for the M4P approach. Please do read it. We are also going to be releasing a series of podcasts in the near future that will help you in your comms. Thank you so much, Richard.
And don't forget the blog series as well.
Of course, and there's a blog series too.
Everything in the pyramid of engagement for you to chow down on in bite-sized chunks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Nabila. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.